This is Comic Shenanigans, episode 1074, Comic Talk with Amazing Spider Talks at Dan Gvozden.
Ain't no stopping them shenanigans. Love getting into shenanigans. All up in them shenanigans. 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 Shenanigans.
Welcome to the Comic Shenanigans podcast. I'm your host, Adam Chapman. This is episode 1074. Very excited to welcome back to the show frequent guest in the past, typically of centennial episodes, Dan Gvozden, as we sit down to talk about a few issues of Amazing Spider-Man that you may not have read. Amazing Spider-Man 426 to 428. It's during one of my favorite periods in Spider-Man comics, and I think maybe just mine. It's the post-Clone Saga pre-relaunch period, which featured storylines such as Spider Hunt, Identity Crisis, The Gathering of Five, and the final chapter, amongst others. Those are most notably the ones that are typically available in collected edition format and really nothing else. So this was a lot of fun to talk to Dan about these comics and also just to have him back on the show, as he's always a favorite guest of mine. If you're coming over from the Amazing Spider Talk podcast, thank you so much for joining us. There's a tremendous back catalog, first of Dan Gvozden appearances, as he made his first appearance in episode 298, and from that point forward was in every centennial episode that I had on for the show. And also we have a tremendous backlog of creator interviews, including 2 interviews with Mark Bagley that I did earlier in 2024. Thank you for choosing to ring in the new year with us. This is our first podcast of 2025, although we recorded it in 2024, so it's a bit of a cheat. But thank you so much for joining us for the Comic Shenanigans podcast and to listen to Dan's dulcet tones. You can email me at comicshenanigans@gmail.com, rate the show on Apple Podcasts, listen to us on Apple Podcasts, and also listen to us on Spotify. Thank you so much for listening. Happy New Year, everyone. And let's jump right into the conversation with Dan. Enjoy. Dan, welcome back to the Comic Shenanigans podcast. How are you today?
I feel like I've gone to heaven, Adam. Like last time I talked to you, I thought the show was ending, and here I am in like post-mortem of this show. Adam, how has heaven been for you? You couldn't quit, could you? You couldn't stop podcasting. It's part of your blood.
Yeah, I really miss talking to creators and having an excuse to do so and a platform to do so. And, it's interesting. I came back, and in the first year back, finally got my white whale, got my, 2, I talked to Mark Bagley for 3 to 4 hours or something crazy. Like, that was my white whale. That was the one where I'm like, I'm never going to get that. I remember saying multiple times if I ever talked to Mark Bagley that I would just cancel the podcast. I didn't do that. But that, it was nice to come back, nice to talk to creators again. It was exactly 1 year to the day that I was gone, and then I was glad to be back. And I was going to wait and have you on episode 1100, but I just couldn't wait that long because it takes so long to get there now. Because instead of doing 100 episodes a year, now I'd only do 52. So I was like, you know what? It's time to bring Dan back for, I think this is episode 1074. So I just couldn't wait another 26 weeks.
I appreciate it, Adam. I think it's funny, the Bagley thing. I think you had the equation backwards. You needed to cancel the show to get Mark Bagley, not get Mark Bagley to cancel the show. Adam, this has been a long-running joke between not only you and I, but I think just in general in my Slack channel for my show, is that you get all the guests that I can't get. Anytime I'm like, man, I really tried to get this, you're like, I just got him. And so like your show remains the kind of bastion for people I wish I could talk to on my show.
It's funny you say that, and it seems to keep happening. I guess Joe Caramagna was the most recent one.
He told me explicitly. He told me explicitly that he doesn't do podcasts.
Interesting. I think I might have had help there because I had done an interview with Chris Eliopoulos, who's head of virtual calligraphy, and also Ariana Marr, who is also someone that has worked with Joe with virtual calligraphy as well. So maybe that helped grease the wheels.
I'll tell myself that. I think the reality is I'm hosting a Spider-Man podcast, and the less people can go and talk about Spidey means the less trouble to get into. And Cody Ziegler was I guess a pretty good example who appeared on my show and promptly got in deep trouble for talking too much on my show. So what are you going to do? Anyway, I'm not here to talk about that, Adam, although I am very grateful to be invited back on. Like happy that you're podcasting again, although the minute I stop podcasting is the minute I throw away all of my gear and make it impossible to podcast again. This is my curse to bear, and if I could just lift this curse, Adam, I would be very eager to do so.
I think you'd miss it, though. Well, I mean, obviously you're friends with Mark now anyway, but I think you'd miss having an artifice to stimulate conversation and keep it going with Mark, and then also, creating that community during the Spider Slack and everything. And I think you'd miss it more than you realize. And,
so what you're saying is it's not a curse, it's a character flaw.
There you go.
Okay, I'll take it.
So what's interesting is, I was like, I got to have Dan back on the show. It's always a pleasure to have Dan on. And then you're like, well, what are we talking about? And I'm like, crap, I don't know. I would just shoot the shit with you for hours. I'm like, all right, I got to come up with something. So I had recently, actually, I think an episode or 2 episodes ago, I was doing a Book of the Month club. And usually my 2 friends and I, we've been going through the entire Clone Saga because we're fans somehow, even though it's not always great. And so we had taken a month off from doing Clone Saga, and I was like, let's do Christmas themed stories. And so we had done the Amazing Spider-Man issue where Spider-Man gets evicted, which is by McFarlane, and I also picked Amazing Spider-Man 420, which was Spider-Man and X-Man teaming up and for the holidays. And it's kind of a weird issue, but it's always been one I liked. And I'm like, you know what? I'm already living in this headspace. I already love this kind of post-Clone Saga pre-relaunch period. Let's talk about Amazing Spider-Man in the kind of 420s. So I picked out Amazing Spider-Man 426 to 428. That's by Tom DeFalco. We got art by Steve SKROCE. So I'm very curious, one, had you read this before? I'm assuming you had. And 2, when did you first read this? Was it like live? Was it when this was first occurring, or was this later on?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the exact year that I first read this. I've said on my show many times, and I'll say it here, that like I started collecting in the kind of like late 300s, and by the time it hit the Clone Saga, in the 90s, well, I guess the 300s was the 90s as well, but by the time it like hit the Clone Saga proper and the stories were bouncing across multiple titles, like I just didn't have the income to keep up with it. And that's where I kind of lost the thread of, reading a monthly comic, which is kind of what I signed on for when I started reading Amazing Spider-Man, and that changed very quickly in the Clone Saga. It was like 4 or 5 titles it was stretched across at any given time.
4 monthlies and a quarterly.
Yeah, and then there's all the little like pop-up miniseries and one-shots that were there. There was just no way I could afford to do it on my, like, I think it was like a $5 a month allowance or something. So instead, I started looking to back issues, and that's where I really got into collecting. So I didn't get back to reading monthly Spider-Man until like Ultimate Spider-Man and the start of the Straczynski run. So like early 2000s is where I kind of jumped back on. So, I guess I just missed this by like a year or 2, or maybe 3 years. But eventually I picked this story up. I can't imagine that I picked it up all at one time, because I actually think this like run of comics, it's not quite as hard to find as like the Howard Mackie reboot stuff. But they're not ones you see stacked up all over the place. They can be a little bit trickier to find. So I have to think I must have read this like 2008 for the first time, and I think it's the only time I've read it. This is not an era that I've revisited much, although I know you're very fond of it. And I don't really know why. I think I wasn't really enamored with it at the time, but reading it for this today, I really enjoyed this little story. I thought this was really great and reminded me of classic Tom DeFalco, and even more like Steve SKROCE, who's not someone that I've like really highlighted in the past as a favorite artist of mine. I think he handles this material spectacularly. I've read a lot of stuff that he's done, and it's always like like fits into the Spider-Man world. But in this 3-issue story, I was really impressed with how maybe it's the Dr. Octopus of it all. I was really impressed with his art on this, the way that it utilized what makes Spider-Man unique as a crime fighter, the kind of like verticality and the different like locations and him kind of flinging himself all around and moving quickly. That stuff really got emphasized. And reading this, I was like, man, this is a Spider-Man comic. And that's due to those talents. But this was really exciting and a fun revisit. So thank you for kind of pushing this one on me.
So I have a couple questions. So it's interesting, obviously, as you say, you kind of ended up reading it so much later. Given how much work and how much we've seen Doc Ock in the last 15 years, it's interesting to go back to kind of a retro Ock who it was interesting that, Tom DeFalco did not want Doc Ock to die. He didn't think that was a good idea. And he almost immediately, like as soon as he's back on the book, he's already figuring out a way to bring Doc Ock back. And I think that was obviously the right call because Doc Ock is one of Spider-Man's best villains. He didn't deserve to go out the way that he did. What I've always appreciated about how he brought him back, and even as a kid, I remember like really appreciating this. And I think I would have been 13, 14 when these books came out, is that they didn't retcon that Doc Ock died. He was dead. This is the Marvel Universe. There are mystical things all over. They just figured out a mystical way to bring him back, but he did die. And I always appreciated that this wasn't a retcon. This was just moving the story forward. And that feels very much like a DeFalco thing that doesn't really love retcons if you can get away with them. He'd rather give you an explanation.
Yeah, DeFalco's not quite that cheap. I mean, he has his ups and downs, but like he is committed to the Marvel timeline and just continuing the stories. I didn't even like hesitate to imagine that Tom DeFalco would like cheat in such a way. I mean, like maybe it's not quite as as high powered as this Mary Jane. I mean, if you want to call that a retcon, like her past being revealed. Like that's a guy who's working with the material on the page and finding a way to make it work. And I think he does so here. I have some reservations about like how he manages to resurrect Dr. Octopus and both the like cleanliness of it and the fact that like I think there's a lot of stories here that don't really get followed up on. And that's not necessarily his fault. This was a pretty like tumultuous era of Spider-Man comics. But he pulls it off, and I don't see people referencing this story much or the Hand's involvement in bringing back Dr. Octopus. I think everybody's like kind of just eager to be like, we're moving on to Ock is back, and we need not think about the mistake of killing him off all that much. Even in stuff with Kane, I don't see like Otto really remembering that guy killed him at some point.
That's a good point.
Yeah, but this is a totally like within the logic of this story, I think it's really solid.
What I think is, I should point out. So it's interesting. One thing I've talked about with Tom before when I've had him on the show is that the True Believers are supposed to be this offshoot of the Hand. And I'm like, where did this come from? He's like, the artist drew the Hand the wrong color and put them in different costumes. And I'm like, like Steve SKROCE didn't really, I guess, the memo. And so instead of putting them in traditional Hand gear, he started putting them in like green and other things. So he just pivoted it because he's a professional. And it's like, all right, it doesn't need to be the Hand specifically. It can be this other sect of the Hand that's broken away. And so a lot of the stories during this period deal with the True Believers and then their connection with Black Tarantula. And so again, really trying to ground the stories a little bit more in Obviously, there's still some mysticism to it, but yeah. A question I have for you as well, whenever I have anyone read anything from this period, and you've just read 3 issues, so there's a lot of subplots because, again, Tom is a classic Marvel writer, so there's a lot going on here. When you got to the end of 428, did you feel the urge to follow the text box and check out Spider-Man Unlimited number 18, or did you have the urge to check out 429? Like, did it make you want to continue at all or see what happened next?
Oh, absolutely. I didn't. I have those issues sitting next to me right now, and I could very well, and I think at a different point in my life I would have. I've got a lot of things. I have a 2-year-old, but like even beyond that, I have a lot of things going on regarding Spider-Man at the moment that digging that out really couldn't make its way to the top of my read pile. But I would. I don't think when I was reading this initially, read it through chronologically, right? I picked all the stuff up, and at first I collected Amazing Spider-Man before I collected all of those other books, the Unlimiteds and so on. So I actually haven't ever read it, in that fashion. I am doing kind of a bit of a big reread across the multiple different titles for another project that I can't announce at the moment. And so I'm looking forward to getting to this era and being able to do what I couldn't do as a kid, which is to say afford multiple titles at the same time. So, I definitely want to, I'm going to get through all of this. So, absolutely. This was a compelling story. Now, as to other stories in this run, I know you said you had a soft spot for like the X-Man character, and that story. And like, I've reread like elements of the DeFalco run, and while I find it like his individual writing very charming, it is Spider-Man, whether it's the True Believers or X-Men or whatever, kind of going up against a like who's who of characters that like have kind of been forgotten to time, at least in Spider-Man lore. Like even the supporting cast from this era has kind of largely been ignored. Dr. Octopus is a major outlier, which I think is what makes the story kind of like stand apart, although he doesn't really show up truly until the final part of it. Although he has that incredible debut page in 427 where he crashes through the wall. What an image. I don't think this is a very like remembered or referenced era, and so I'm glad you gave me a reason to dive back in, because like keeping up with Spider-Man doesn't really require you to know much about any of this.
No, it really doesn't. It's interesting. You're right. I've never understood why this era in particular got so forgotten. Like the Clone Saga was like radioactive, but still had people talking about it. And so like they wouldn't actively reference it in most comics. They did briefly during this period, and then they kind of didn't touch it for like 9 years. But for some reason, this period just never got talked about. It. Now, some of the issues ended up being, put into trade paperbacks. We have the Identity Crisis trade paperback. I think the Gathering of Five and the final chapter ended up in one. Spider Hunt, Identity Crisis, and I think that's it. So I don't know why those ones in particular got the trade paperback treatment, so that people can kind of re-experience them. At least they're all on Marvel Unlimited. I'm very happy about that. There's no kind of gaps here in terms of Amazing Spider-Man, but it's always been very interesting to me that it was so forgotten. And you're right, the supporting cast has been largely forgotten. Jill Stacy, I don't remember the last time we ever heard of her. Arthur Stacy, like all the Stacys really. And I think that's probably what I liked about it at the time, is that it had this, it had this feeling of the era that felt very strong, and I liked the characters. And then when Howard Mackie took over with John Byrne, when it was just the two of them writing the relaunch book, a lot of this just kind of evaporated. And that was one of the things that I always thought about JMS's run, is that really didn't have a supporting cast at all. Like it was really very thin bench at that point, and it was really just Peter, Mary Jane, and Aunt May. You had some other incidentals, but you didn't really see them in the same way. And then the subplots kind of went the way of the dodo as well, and so you just had a very kind of skinny book. Thankfully, it's not quite as skinny anymore, but I feel like this period still has this kind of wider breach. Like in these 3 issues, how many different characters did you see that all had their own subplots that had nothing to go on with Peter? That's kind of refreshing, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I mean it's how Spider-Man comics were for the longest time. It's kind of like, indicative of almost like reliving the like mid to late 80s again, which is like Tom and Ron were doing something very classically inspired, and keeping alive the classic approach to Spider-Man before Todd McFarlane and David Michelinie would come in and completely change everything. And I don't think they completely upended the way Spider-Man stories are told necessarily, more than the art, and the more kind of, I guess, modern approach to writing and all of that stuff. It was a lot way less hoo-ha, as they would say. So like maybe it's after the Clone Saga, like, Tom is comfortable and a comfortable voice for you and I, but like, were people looking for a more classically styled Spider-Man? I don't know. I think I certainly came back on the book with JMS because it felt like the modern way of writing Spider-Man had finally arrived, and I agree with you. The supporting cast is very thin. But like, it's a very different writing style than what Tom DeFalco was doing, and probably still maybe the most modern version of writing the character. I wish the character was still being written by like JMS. To me, that felt like the most like contemporary Spider-Man we got. So I don't know. I mean, like, maybe this stuff just kind of feels like there's no big high concept. It's kind of doing the Spider-Man formula again. And so like there's nothing to really make it stand out from the 425 issues that preceded it.
Mm-hmm. You're probably right. I mean, even thinking one of the core tenets of the run was also, they have the Rose, and who is the Rose? Who's the Black Tarantula? Like, there are some mysteries here, but they're not high water mysteries that you think of Amazing Spider-Man 4. They were fine. I think the Rose in particular, looking back on it now, seeing how SKROCE in particular draws him, and like a lot of interesting, like kind of flowery elements on his chest, does not belie the character who it is. So I'm curious if Tom had already figured out who he wanted the Rose to be, or if he was just kind of spinning plates. You mentioned before that the idea of the big villains. I mean, he did get to play with Electro, and definitely did like a cool Electro story. But again, that's not one that people really talk about either. Like, none of this is talked about. It always hurts me inside because I love this period, and part of it's, I was the right age for it, and but I do think there's a lot of fun action to it. Thinking of the broader Spider-Man line at the time, so you had Tom writing Amazing Spider-Man, you had J.M. DeMatteis back on Spectacular Spider-Man, you had Howard Mackie doing Spider-Man with JR, and then you had Sensational, which is by Todd DeFalco, who's probably the youngest voice in the room at that point between those four people. So that one probably had more of the youthful vibe of Spider-Man, and he had Mike Wieringo in art. So probably there was more of that kind of vibe going on there that would have felt probably very different from the other three books because you had a younger voice.
Yeah, absolutely. And I got to think, like, some of these guys have kind of like, they've just come out the other end of the Clone Saga. Like, they're kind of beaten up at this point, like I got to think like morale was pretty all over the place at this time in Spider-Man comics. It was like, okay, we're missing our major hook of the Clone Saga. Let's go back to doing some classic tales, with the character. And I love the DeFalco Wieringo stuff. I just had him on the show to talk about that Sensational run, and I think it's a kind of quiet classic. So maybe I'm missing the other quiet classic, which is the second DeFalco run. But like, I think even as a reader, when I've done my big binges, like, I get through the Clone Saga and I'm like, woof, I'm just like waiting for JMS to come on the book and kind of like clean everything up a little bit. But I think we'll probably belabor this point, but I really like the story, and so I kind of want to chastise myself from 15 years ago for maybe not skipping over the area, but maybe not giving it the level of focus that it really deserved.
It's interesting. I'll kind of one last comment to kind of jump on yours, which I thought was interesting. The idea that, as you said, they're coming through the war that was the Clone Saga, and it's over now. So they definitely are beaten down. But I think that's probably why I've always gravitated towards some of these stories, is because it feels like they're having fun again, because they're not they're not doing part 3 of 16 anymore. Like, they're telling their own stories. Like, Tom's able to quietly do his own thing and his own subplots. He's not really worried about, the supporting cast from another book. You don't see, Hope, the girl who lives next door in this book. You see her in DeFalco's book. Like, they kind of have their own supporting cast. There's not as much bleed over. There are some characters, obviously, like J. Jonah Jameson, who are going to appear throughout, but some of the more niche characters are kind of used by specific writers, and so you don't have as much of them having to be like, well, how do I serve this bigger story? Now they're just doing their story. And if you look at DeFalco's first, post Clone Saga story, isn't that the Savage Land story? Like, it's totally just, kind of a nuts throw it, just throwing something against the wall, seeing what sticks, and having a really fun time with it. And over, in Spider-Man, you have JR giving some really dark and really good criminal stories. So Howard Mackie really leans into that. So each book felt different. And again, it felt like they were finally able to, throw off the chains of being stuck as part of a machine and actually do something that they like to do with Spider-Man. And JMD, I'm surprised they even brought him back, to be honest, because I think he had left earlier. I'm surprised they were able to woo him back. I love some of his stuff during this period, because he does, like, now I'm trying to remember, but like a bunch of loser Spider-Man villains all together. Like, he does some really fun stuff. He also does Spectacular Spider-Man 250, which is one of my favorite Norman Osborn stories, which has him kind of return. So there's some really good hidden gems. I'm an apologist for this period, but I think it's got a lot of really good stuff. I'm still looking forward to. I'm actually sad that they haven't done it yet, but that they're going to eventually get to the Amazing Spider-Man Epic collections that will collect at least the Amazing Spider-Man stuff, and I cannot wait for that, to not have to worry about just having all my singles at hand anymore and just being able to have it on my shelf, because I've been waiting for years for that.
Well, I'm excited for you. I haven't dove into the Epic collection stuff yet. I have all my singles, and I don't know how I feel about that. Like, maybe it would have been smarter to go for the epics, but I think my patience would not have allowed me, or lack of patience wouldn't have allowed me to wait for the books to come out. I think the other thing, like you're describing it, like that feels very schizophrenic to me, like having so many different approaches to this book. And I love that, because, like, honestly, I want writers to just tell me a good story. So I want them to be passionate about what they're telling, and Spider-Man, has enough flexibility to, take on different genres and approaches and stuff like that. But like, the line probably felt very schizophrenic at the time, and I could, imagine that might be why people don't feel any particular attachment to, what is this era? I can't define it. It's just an era defined by a lot of different types of stories. And, again, like, and that means it's hard for any of the writers to write as if the other stories have happened and really matter. I mean, the end of all this is Gathering of Five, and, speak of a story that, like, had major repercussions and is not referenced ever again. I think there's just a lot of stuff that just kind of got, like, ignored as like, we don't really know what our plan was at the time, and so we're just going to keep moving forward. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. So you talked about Steve SKROCE and being kind of surprised by how much, like, he was really well suited to some of the Spider-Man stuff. And it's interesting looking at it. I would say faces are not really his strong point, but when you have Spider-Man in a full body costume, he does amazing things with Spider-Man. Like, because you don't need that level of detail with the face or any of that stuff that I would say at times he's not as solid on. Instead, he's so good at really getting you into the action. As you said, like, his choreography with Spider-Man, all the, the fights they have in vents, kind of skittering around, like, that's only really a fight that Spider-Man could have against someone else. That's not, like, it felt very proprietary to Spider-Man. And yeah, like, even like in the first issue, where the final shot has Spider-Man just kind of laying prone, with all these like, chains around him. There's just something about the musculature of Spider-Man and how he looks that I just really like.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I've never connected with SKROCE like Peter Parker. He looks kind of like a doofus, it's like overly musculatured. There's just something kind of like, I don't recognize him as Peter Parker, and but like the Spider-Man is very well, I mean, in the first issue, he's straight up aping Ditko for like some of the scenes where it calls back. But there, and it's all very kind of cartoony and exaggerated. And in fact, it kind of reminds me of like Ryan Stegman's modern stuff, where like characters are very animalistic or exaggerated in many ways. Peter too. I mean, he's like chiseled chin, very emotionally emotive, kind of guy. Carolyn Traynor is very clean lines, and she seems very like erudite and smart, and she's always got a very like stiff posture. Like his characters tell you a lot about the person, but his Spider-Man is like the most fun. Like I don't know many artists that I think it's not just the posing, it's like how he incorporates the environment into Peter's stuff. I mean, maybe it calls back to like Ross Andrew, but like it's more dynamic than even that. Like he's not only rendering buildings of Manhattan, but like Peter is interacting with his environment in a way that like I think stands apart from many artists, and you can feel the momentum of how he manipulates his swings or where he uses his feet to push off from something. And panels, take advantage of him being like upside down or right side up. Like it really feels like something that's unique to the character of Spider-Man. It could not be another superhero you're seeing on the page. And, even some of my favorite issues, like the recent issue 59 of the Zeb Wells run, where JRJR just was given like a tour de force and like just said, do an amazing action scene. Even someone with like JRJR's history, it didn't really feel like a Spider-Man action scene more than it was like any other slugger. But this is like acrobatic and silly and but still weighty. I really appreciated this. There's a sequence, I believe, in 427 where he's fighting the True Believers and like moving throughout this warehouse, like up levels, indoor, outdoor, all over the place. And it's really fun. It must have taken a lot of work on his part to plan it out, and also to have, like between DeFalco and SKROCE to kind of like map out how this battle occurred. Maybe it's all SKROCE. I don't know, but I really excited by reading it. And any book that highlights what makes Spider-Man special as a character, I'm all for it. Like you got to lean into that.
You are right. The in that particular issue in 427, like the actual fight choreography is not simple. Like you're right. It's going from location to location. Then they're going to flip out of this. They're going to go in here. Like it, and you do feel every step of the way that you're with them. Like, and some pencilers don't have that level of skill, or it becomes just more of a brawl. But you're right. This is always feel like it's taking advantage of Spider-Man's abilities. But it's interesting because he always feels like he's on the back heel anyway, even though in theory he's doing things that are well suited to him, which is part of what makes it an enjoyable story. That Spider-Man's always kind of on the back heel. Artistically, I forget what it's called. I'm sure you'll know. But when you have the panels where Spider-Man's doing multiple different poses, but then we see one that's fully rendered and then the others are more faded out. I do love that effect. I forget what it's called. But I love when it's done well, and SKROCE does some really good versions of that here. And that's, again, one of those things where you can really feel the speed of the character. And it's not like a character like the Flash where it would just be, kind of in a straight line. He's flipping and doing all sorts of other things, and that's really unique to him as a character.
it's comedic too. Like there's a sequence where he runs up a wall and you feel the verticality because you're looking down on him as he's barreling forward up the side of the wall and incorporating that effect. I'm forgetting the name of it too. And then he gets to the rooftop where there's a whole group of these like ninjas and he peels a ladder off of the wall and then, uses the ladder to like capture the ninjas and then using his super strength, like ping pongs them, as he calls it, wall whacker, like back and forth off the wall. And like, it's a very comedic thing that like only fits in with Spider-Man and his skill set and his approach to like kind of silly, almost like, I would say shenanigans on this show, but like kind of like not taking it entirely seriously. It's just a lot of fun. And I really, that sequence lives with me now. But like almost every panel is like that. Like later in the comic, you've got him, dodging, giant fists and stuff. And at the same time, you've got ninjas diving at him with spears, and you've got all the motion lines, and it's just really well planned and organized from an action storytelling. You get all of the momentum because he not only does he catch the guy with the spear, he then like flings him away, shoots a web at him, catches him midair, and then spins him in a circle to knock other guys out. It's really fun stuff. And I would love to know, like, I mean, maybe it's too piecemeal of a question to ask, but like, I'd love to know the process for designing something like it's so integrated into the text. I have to think it's some part of the collaboration between DeFalco and SKROCE to pull off action scenes of this kind of silly caliber.
It's a good question. I would feel that I don't think they had a lot of collaboration, so it would either be in the tight plot that DeFalco would have given him, or he just let Steve do it and then he went Marvel style at it. Like it's a great question. I would love to ask Steve. I've talked to him years ago, but it was more of a kind of a general thing. We didn't zero in on something in particular, but it would be interesting to talk about something like this.
Yeah, I mean, the rest of it, like, there's certainly some dated elements to it in terms of its art approach. You've got the kind of like early stages of digital coloring that couldn't quite render stuff. Like it almost feels like early days of like comic book coloring, and like you can feel the limitations of like the color type or I guess the medium, the printing technology, and the like ability to render things. Like there's an overuse of gradients that are not particularly well controlled, and this is something you'd see in all comics at the time. The colors tend to be a little more like I don't know if fluorescent is the right word for it, but there's like a soft kind of glow to them that always stands out to me from like late 90s comics. But the inks are really smooth and beautiful. So like this is a fun book to look at. Out of costume, it's less familiar to me. It's a little bit like dreamlike and a little less structured than I'm used to Spider-Man comics being. But like, it makes sense that when he transforms into Spider-Man, that like those like more lines with more movement in them really come to life.
Well, you mentioned it earlier, but that that big splash where we finally get the return of Doc Ock is an excellent splash. There's some really good use of shadow, so you don't even actually see Ock's face. You just see that kind of the outline of his mouth and his teeth, and you have his glasses kind of reflecting, which is a great shot. I'm curious how you feel. I mean, again, out of context, it might be different. When he died, we got a very different version of Doc Ock that was pulling through from what Larson had done, where he was in the business suit, he was starting to look a little bit different, and now where he's back in the green jumpsuit. So I'm curious how you feel about that kind of return. I mean, eventually, I'm trying to think even when we see Doc Ock after this, because it's a while. Because I think, isn't it when the JMS run, or actually, I guess Howard Mackey used him once in issue 12, but we didn't see a lot of Doc Ock for a while, but he was put back in the jumpsuit. I'm curious if you felt that was a regression or if you think that was necessary.
I mean, it's obviously a regression, but like I like this version more. Like I kind of like my Doc Ock kind of demented. Like the business suit is very like calculating and a business like. I mean, it's a very like his posture changed then too. He would always have a straight back, and it felt like a guy who was more in control of himself enough that he could get up in the morning and put like a suit on. And like, I kind of like the Dr. Octopus that is like brilliant, but like truly unhinged by the accident. And, yeah, I mean, that's why he's fat. That's why he is like pure ego, just run rampant. And, yeah, I like this version. I think it's really cool. I think it like the look of it on the page is great. I want to know where he got his teeth whitened. The sort of like the ink is wonderful on this page. Like it's kind of in these pools of black that are kind of like I don't know, like squid like it's not. It doesn't feel like line. It feels like it was almost spilled on the page, And I feel like that fits with Dr. Octopus and is sort of like, I know octopuses don't have ink, but there is something kind of like liquid about it, and so it really has a lot of life in it in this splash. And yeah, I don't know. I like this guy. I mean, like I'm a sucker for like Romita Dicko. Stuff. So like, give me the kind of like megalomaniacal Dr. Octopus that like, yeah, I like this. I like it more than the business suit, which I have soft spot for too, but I think this is the premier design.
Mm-hmm. One question I have, which is actually not about Doc Ock at all. I'm just curious. I mean, obviously a big part of DeFalco's run in this kind of the second run was Black Tarantula. And so we do get a big moment from Black Tarantula in the third issue where he beats the crap out of Delilah, breaks her neck, and then heals her again. They haven't done a lot with Black Tarantula. He's around. We see him actually more often than you'd think, but he's not like this anymore. They don't treat him like this. He became a lot more street level. I think Brubaker used him back in his Daredevil run. And so he kicks around from here to there, but he's not like this anymore. So I'm curious what you felt about this version of the Black Tarantula with the little bit that you saw throughout these three issues.
Yeah, I mean, this is the Black Tarantula that I'm mostly familiar with. And he's a character I feel like every time he reappears, it's like his first time appearing, there's not a lot of consistency between, I mean, we have him in Spider-Gwen right now. When was the last time we saw him before that?
During Zdarsky's Daredevil run. I'm pretty sure he was on the island at some point.
Oh, fair enough. I had forgotten about that. But like within the pages of Spider-Man, it's easily been 15, 20 years?
If not more. I'd be hard pressed to tell you the last time we saw Spider-Man at all.
Yeah. So, every time he reappears, I let each writer kind of redefine who he is, I guess, in some way. So this totally felt like right in line with, like my impression of him, which is to say it's not very strong. Like, I remember liking the character, but he shows up so infrequently that like, I'm kind of open to people moving him where they want to move him. What do you think of are you a fan of his the way he's been interpreted in the latest Spider-Gwen series?
Now I'm blanking on it completely, even though I know I've read it. I think I've made peace with the fact that he'll never be the Black Tarantula that I first liked, because he's been so many different things since this era that I'm kind of like, all right. I'm just glad to see the character, I guess.
Now he's I guess a legacy character, which is something I wasn't expecting, but like I think it's working pretty solidly.
It's his son, right?
Yeah, that's my understanding. Yeah.
So, that brings up a lot of questions for me, just because, first of all, just in terms of how aging works, that doesn't seem right.
Sure.
Because Spider-Man should be much older then, given how old he was in this period. But you know what? I'm okay with it. again, they're using the character in some way, and if you can try and further what that character could be, then I'm not really against it. The character never really showed up that much anyway, so I guess you said, like, it can kind of always be the first time. I mean, he made so few appearances. I mean, just looking at it, it does look like after DeFalco's run, he didn't show up again until the Brubaker Daredevil run, which is what I thought. And he was there for a while, and then he kind of disappeared after Shadowland. And so, yeah, he's very infrequently used.
Let me ask you about this, because here's a question I had for you, Adam. Not having revisited this for, almost, I guess, over 15 years, I was lacking context about what's happening at the end of 427. There's an image, like, we've got Dr. Octopus reborn in that amazing splash, and then we get a double page splash of a JRJR, like Dr. Octopus rising out of his grave. What was that? Is that just a random inclusion, or?
It was a double gatefold cover. So the front cover pulled out, and it was half of it was Doc Ock's face, and then the second kind of pulled out part was just a close up on him starting to unmask Peter. That was on. So you got to remember, this was during the period where they had the guide to whatever the character was when he pulled out the cover. So a lot of the covers had that kind of pull out anyway, which is why you would have that. Why they decided to do it on the back as well, I don't know. And that's where you got that JRJR. Actually, before we started recording, I was showing it to my son. I'm like, look, there's a double pull out. And he's like, but they don't connect. I'm like, yeah, I don't know why they did it. It's a good JRJR image, but I would say not really a good Doc Ock image, because the face doesn't look like Doc Ock at all. The hair doesn't really match, but it's still a cool looking image. It almost looks like Peter Parker was buried with these tentacles. Like, it just doesn't look like Doc Ock, but it's an interesting.
That's 100% what I thought. I guess I mean, like, maybe I folded this out one time when I read the comic, but I totally didn't recognize this image at all. And I thought, maybe it's an image from like another ongoing series, like Unlimited or something, and there was some crossover I'd forgotten about. But I saw this image, it was so foreign to me. And the way that it's, I read this digitally just because I'm in the middle of moving like my collection and into a new home for it. And I was like, well, wait a minute, like, I don't have the ability to dig that book out right now. Like, what is this image? And thank you for clarifying for me, but it's a very strange image to kind of end, at least digitally, on it. There's no context for it. I'm kind of frankly shocked that they included it, this double page, this fold out in the digital. I'm glad it's there for, like posterity, but it is context free. It's very odd.
Yeah, I'm shocked that they included it at all. I would not have expected them to. As you said, like, there's so many things that don't make it in that I just figured that would have been one of them. Like, usually covers don't seem to be a high priority. I wish I knew why. Like, I'm starting to think of things more as the business too. I'm like, well, why would they have had the budget to do a back gatefold? Like, for issue 427, this isn't issue 425. Like, at least that would make a little bit more sense to me, but it's just kind of a random issue of Amazing Spider-Man. I guess it's the return of Doc Ock, but even then, like, that doesn't. Yeah, something about it just feels very weird. And again, you'd almost expect it to be something where at least it linked up with the back, but it's just its own image. So there really was no reason for it, but it's here.
Yeah, it's a curious image. I mean, the return of Doc Ock, I'm sure they wanted to make some kind of collector's item, out of it, and certainly it has some historical significance, undoing the error, so to speak. So yeah, neat though. It's a weird way to sell a comic with a double, page fold out at the end, but something worth noting. But I gotta say though, like, counter to that, 428's opening is really spectacular. With Spider-Man saving this little girl from Dr. Octopus, like, you can tell that Steve SKROCE like put his all into those pages. They're so detailed and fun.
Absolutely, yeah. No, they're a lot of fun. I actually want to go back to 427 just for a second because I just pulled up the digital version, and on the digital version on the second page, which is again the other part of the opening cover, that is actually not the same image that's in the printed version. This is almost like a zoomed out version because the version that's actually printed is much tighter, and you don't see kind of the nose at the bottom that are under the glasses. Like, it's interesting. I'm curious like how they found the digital file because they didn't use what was actually printed. So it's the same image, but it's just a different aspect ratio. And I'm curious how they went back to get it because that's not in the original version. It's a much tighter cropped version.
Well, I had that question generally about all the digital stuff is like, where are they pulling all of this art from? You know, like it's always in such pristine condition. Like, what kind of files or what kind of scans do they have of the stuff to, to do this? I mean, obviously, most of the stuff they release is the modern stuff where it's just part of the workflow. But like, I'd love to meet the guy at Marvel or DC that is in charge of like making sure that stuff gets processed in the way that it is. And yeah, I got to imagine it's a lot of work to do if it wasn't already incredibly organized. Maybe it was done years and years and years ago, and I'm overvaluing what they're doing. But it's just such a huge project of undertaking of finding high quality images of all of this material. But anyway.
Mm-hmm. Well, I can't speak to the more modern stuff, which I still think of this as being, even though it's, over 25 years old. But I know that for a lot of the older material, I've talked to, my God, I'm going to blank on his name, and that's awful. I've spoken at length with an individual who was very much involved and is one of the main restoration guys on more of the legacy projects. That would be, oh my God, I'm forgetting his name. And it's so terrible of me. Corey Seidelmeyer. So I've talked to him a bunch of times in the show. He's a friend of the show as well. And so a big part of his job has been in the past, like going to like a warehouse and like just trying to sort through this stuff. And so they've done a lot of work over the years to find all of it and put it into proper order because a lot of it was just all over the place. I can't speak necessarily to the 90s stuff because he works more on the kind of legacy 60s, 70s stuff. But for a long time, a lot of it was not organized at all. And so he's spent a lot of the last like 10, 15 years just organizing this stuff and finding stores of material and then being part of the restoration to actually bring it to collected editions. He's the main guy doing all the restoration for the Masterworks. So there's a lot of work that they've been doing to do that. Again, I don't know about the 90s stuff per se, but I would imagine it was very similar.
Yeah. Well, that's amazing. I'm going to have to go listen to that episode. So Amazing Spider-Man 428 is like a giant action scene. It's also really fun. I mean, for me, a highlight is Peter getting behind the wheel of a car and driving through Doc Ock's tentacles. It's just a fun image to see Spider-Man behind the seat of like just a random car and admitting that he doesn't really know how to drive it. So it's just more like he's loosely guiding a missile. But there's a play with like SKROCE does of the environment of Manhattan. He really places the stuff. So like when he's chasing Otto, it's like going down the middle of the street and there's destruction and you really get the scale of it. Like you are a bystander that happens to be watching, these larger than life characters. I find that stuff really fun and really lacking in modern Spider-Man comics. They're like, every once in a while you get something. This is like constant and throughout, and it really puts you there. And I think this stuff is just wonderful.
I do agree that grounding in the reality of where they are is less of a focus, which is unfortunate. And it's definitely something that you go back and you see like Ross Andrew. And like you feel everything because he took so much reference, and so every action that's happening, you can see where it's actually happening. Whereas you're right, it's not, you don't always feel that grounding here. I also really love that bit with the car, just because it's a fantastic visual, and like why wouldn't he do that? Like he has to throw something at Doc Ock, he's just going to get in this car and, as you said, kind of make it into a missile and just launch it at this guy. Like it's seeing Spider-Man be resourceful, using the environment, but also, being aware of his own, shortcomings as a driver, to kind of make it work. But it's a lot of fun.
I mean, it's a ruthless fight. Like Otto takes down a building, just to distract Spider-Man. And the classic, like, you got to stop fighting me to save other people. And you get a really nice, like, I don't know if it's truly an Amazing Spider-Man 33 reference, but you get like a heroic pose of Spider-Man standing, lifting rubble over his head to keep people safe underneath him. It's like beautifully done and full of detail. And I really like this stuff. And, then it goes back to showing like, Peter and MJ, who I find kind of vaguely unrecognizable here. I mean, it's clearly them, but like it doesn't really adhere to this kind of house style that you might expect those characters to operate under. But like anytime this guy's drawing Spider-Man, like it's really excellent. And the emotions in this book are really heightened too. I mean, you've got like Otto standing over Angelina and her body after she kind of gave up her, I don't know what you want to call it, her soul or whatever, to revive him. Is it an emotional page? I mean, you've got like Otto's crying tears like that are pouring over her bloodied up body, but his whole body looks like it's melting on top of her. And like it's really emotional, maybe over the top. But this is a comic that goes for it.
Absolutely. Well, and as you mentioned, like that moment of making Peter have to choose between chasing him or saving. I mean, obviously that's the classic kind of heroic dilemma, but feels more Spider-Man because that's always what he has to do, right? He always has to, not do the one thing because he has to do the other. It's interesting how many times they kept saying that they had uploaded, Doc Ock's, whatever mind essence, whatever they hand wove it to be. And they kept calling it, the master planner. And I'm like, well, that's a nice callback.
Yeah, I mean, if there's one problem I have with like the resurrection of Otto, it's that like I think that there was something more to be done with the fact that the ceremony gets corrupted in some way. Like he's not getting like a full person giving up their life for him. I mean, obviously it like it does like put Angelina in a coma. And Stunner is like the life that gets kind of like sucked out, like her alter ego. But like that, to me, that always read as like kind of a cheat. But a cheat that could be interesting to explore. Like, oh, like Otto came back and at first everything seems fine. But like the longer it goes on, we begin to see that like cheating that ceremony has some damaging effect on Otto or his memory or something to do with VR. I don't know what it would be, but to me that seems like a completely unexplored avenue with like the resurrection of the character, like because it's clearly a cheat and they set it up as a cheat and then nothing really comes of it, which again could be down to the fact that like this isn't the longest run on this book. Like DeFalco probably had a ton of plans he didn't really get to see through to fruition, but like I've always felt that there was an opportunity there that like truly nobody died to resurrect Otto. Like Stunner eventually recovers. I mean, it may not be for 20 years or I guess for 10 years, but like she goes into a coma and we get her back again. Anyway, I don't know if that ever stuck out to you, but it always seemed like a thing to me, like there's an opportunity to showcase how this resurrected Otto is not quite up to his former self.
I mean, I would agree. I don't think it was something I probably thought about at the time, but upon rereading it, I'm like, yeah, they didn't really do anything with that. But again, maybe DeFalco wanted to and just didn't get around to it. And again, we wouldn't see a lot of Doc Ock for a while anyway, so maybe that kind of plays into that if someone else had wanted to pick up that baton, they could have, but they just didn't want to. And again, we didn't get Stunner until trying to remember the year because
Was it Superior? Yeah.
It was like 2013. So yeah, she was gone for 16 years, came back for 2 issues, and that was it. So yeah, the characters made a grand total of like 19 appearances. So she looms large for me. It's fun. I was flipping through the issues with my son at the after dinner, and he was looking at it. He was like, "Oh, that's Stunner." Like I'm like, "That's so funny." Of course, you would know that because I have given him my Clone Saga trades, and so he's like experienced in the Clone Saga. So he doesn't know these other characters that he should know, but he knows Stunner. Who's barely showed up. So, I mean, I guess good on me as a Clone Saga parent, but yeah, it's interesting the things we can latch onto. Again, like I hope to give this run to my son, but again, I haven't really wanted him to give him my singles because I'm like, well, trades I'm okay with him damaging, not my singles. So I'm just waiting for a trade so I can just share it with my son. Read this, son. This is what I love.
I love your designation of Clone Saga parent. That's certainly not something that I knew. Do you guys have a Facebook group? Is that a meetup culture?
I mean, I feel like there should be.
It's like an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. Like, yes, I am a Clone Saga parent. So he knows Stunner. Does he know Delilah? Because man, this is a character I forgot existed. But she does get a stunning exit at the end of 428. Like, what a way to go to end this issue, with her head shoved through a wall and used to carve a giant spider. That one of the darkest things I imagine Tom DeFalco crafting. Like that came from the mind of Tom DeFalco bothers me. Like that's not the guy I know.
No, it's interesting. Yeah. Okay, so a couple of things. Yeah, it's definitely darker. It's interesting that I'm recontextualizing because in and around this period, he would have done the Hercules miniseries with Ron Friends. And now this is important because when he got that job from Tom Brevoort, which I've recently learned from Ron because we did 2 hours talking about this 3-issue Hercules miniseries that no one's ever heard of. But when he gave them the job, the editor did not want them to be doing it. He was like, no, the editor-in-chief, I should say, was like, I don't want a book from them about Hercules. I know what that book's going to look like, and I don't want that. So Tom Brevoort was like, well, I want to give these guys the job. So he told them, he's like, he thinks that he knows what a book from you guys about this character is going to look like. So don't do that. Just, so they took it as a challenge to themselves to try and do something a little bit different. So when you read that series, it does feel like Tom, it does feel like Ron, but it does feel like they've added something different. So I'm curious how close a proximity, I'd have to check the exact dates, that maybe he's trying different things out in his writing, and it allowed him to go a little darker. Because if you read that Hercules series, it definitely feels more violent than you're used to seeing from Tom DeFalco, or what I would imagine a Tom DeFalco book to typically be. But it was, again, because he was kind of being pushed a little bit and someone saying, I'm not going to give you a job because I think, I know what you feel like. So he adapted to that. So I'm curious if this is close to that, and maybe if you're getting a little bit of bleed over from him adapting his style. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting story. I'm amazed how much you keep in your head, Adam. Whenever I come on the show, I'm like, how indexical your memory is remarkable. But I can barely remember half the people that we've talked to on our show. So, and I'm sure you could tell me about them more than I could. But
maybe.
Yeah. Anybody that listened to episode 400 of my show where we were quizzed on the history of the show and we both came up goose egg, we'll know. But I don't know. Just reading this page is really spectacular. This woman's head shoved through a wall and being carved into an image, and ending with oh, was that your neck I just broke? I hadn't remembered this, and I can't ever remember Tom DeFalco going that dark, or that violent on a page. So,
Delilah's an interesting character too, because I always think of her as a Bagley character because he was the one who first drew her. But obviously, SKROCE actually drew more of her, I believe, than anyone else. I think she's only made actually 21 appearances, it would appear. What is most memorable to me is always her affectations in terms of how she speaks, and that you have, the colored word dialogue boxes, which is interesting because it did come up in a conversation with Richard Starkings where he hated this shit. He hated that everyone started getting kind of unique text boxes, and he's like, if I want to know that Iron Man's saying something, it should be obvious from the text that it's Iron Man. It shouldn't be because I colored in, or I lettered the box in a certain way. And so I asked him about Delilah because he was the one who did that one too, and he's like, I didn't like that either. Or at least he's one.
What is your takeaway from that? Like, is it that she is like applying like an affectation of sort of like snootiness? Like what do you take from? Because it's all different font and it's only certain words. What's your takeaway in terms of how she's speaking in those pages?
I think when she was first introduced, it was a sexy thing because they were playing with the character. When she first shows up, she's like on like a stage, and then she's like killing someone with like a microphone, and it's like very sudden, but it was very much about sex appeal. So I think it was meant to be originally more of kind of playing up her sensuality and maybe how she was speaking. At this point, though, I don't think that's the case anymore. I don't know what it is, to be honest. I think it's just they know that this is how she speaks. She speaks with this specific, font style, but I don't think he necessarily is using it in any specific way. Because if you look at the words, you're right, they're not really of anything. Like they're definitely not like a sexy thing. They're definitely not like I'm not sure if they've lost the thread on what that was supposed to be, and instead of just kind of using random words because that's what she does, which is unfortunate because I feel like that's probably taking a cool effect and taking away any meaning behind it and rendering it kind of useless and just a thing you're doing, as opposed to, as I said in that first issue, which is I think Amazing Spider-Man 415, it's a lot more like sensual. At least I always felt that way.
Well, even the font choices seem fairly random, that I couldn't remember this character in clear detail. So I was curious what your impression of that was. I mean, like, the thing that stands out most is that Steve SKROCE likes drawing a sexy lady, and she fits the bill. Like he inserts stuff in here that like I'm surprised they printed in a Amazing Spider-Man comic. So yeah.
True. Although it's interesting because when she's got that kind of weird armor on her head, I guess, again, some of his faces aren't always great. So I think at times, like, she's supposed to be this like beautiful woman who's also like a powerful, brick house. And yet I feel like at times you don't really get that in the way he portrays her. You do get that she's a bruiser, but you don't really get the attractiveness of the character, which I guess is every supervillain to a degree. But they always played it up differently with Delilah. And I think, again, that is part of how they originally used her word bubbles. It's interesting, again, looking at a bunch of these characters, because I grew up on seeing Stunner, on seeing Delilah. In my mind, they're a much bigger part of the Marvel Universe than they are. Both of them, between them, have maybe 40 appearances. But in my mind, because that's when I first kind of started getting into comics, because it's interesting, you got out as I was getting in. Like, I didn't start buying Spider-Man regularly till the month after the Clone Saga. So Tom DeFalco getting a fresh start with, Peter and driving the bus, that's my first issue of buying Amazing Spider-Man regularly. I had read issues before. I had a friend who read a bunch of the Clone Saga stuff, but I wasn't reading it all sequentially. As you said, it was almost impossible for a youth to do that anyway because of the volume of books you needed to read. So I came into it very differently than a lot of people. I found a lot of people were getting out of comics as I was getting in. I was getting into comics when I was like 12, 13. Most people seemed to be exiting the hobby at that time. Instead, I was really discovering it. And I would say that X-Men is what made me a comic book fan, but Spider-Man kept me a fan. And it's, to this day, is really the only ongoing I follow and buy every month. I read a lot of Marvel Unlimited and other things, and I have other friends who read, comics. I sometimes read theirs, but really, Spider-Man's what kept me a fan. X-Men didn't. X-Men brought me in, but couldn't keep me.
Well, you say that, and it's funny because I'm reminded of the end of this issue, which is truly like what's new is old. We're undergoing an arc right now about like Peter learning to kind of take some time off and find joy for himself, and this story, which is like largely about the return of Dr. Octopus, which kind of wraps itself up halfway through the issue, and then we get kind of like some dangling threads, but we get Peter and MJ going to like a toga party where Peter kind of unenthusiastically joins while everybody else is in toga. He's in like a jacket. Like it's a completely different climate that he exists in. And like Mary Jane is kind of like pushing him to, like forget Spider-Man for a night, like, come and have fun with us, and it's a very college atmosphere. Obviously it's a toga party. And it's weird to think like, of them as like the married couple, here. It's a very modern scenario, like at least for the time, like a toga party, college life, and to see them kind of like kissing on the dance floor. It's just, it's weird to think of them as a married couple here. This is a very like flirty kind of youthful scene. Not to say people don't get married young, but like I feel like you could already kind of see some of the desire here to like de-age these characters and get rid of that sort of like weight of marriage on them. I don't know how you respond to revisiting this. I found it shockingly youthful for the Peter Parker of this era.
I think you're right, but I think it makes sense actually in story as well. If you think about it, like, the whole plot of, MJ wanted to go back to school is largely coming back also the fact that she just had a miscarriage.
Yeah.
And so that was a very traumatic thing in her life that, obviously Peter had his own Spider-Man stuff going on, which is, upsetting enough with the loss of Ben and everything, but she lost her child. So she needs to figure out a new pivot. She was like, I'm going to be a mom. She was excited. Now that's taken away from her. So she's going back to school, trying to find a direction. So I do find that her trying to, reconnect with maybe who she was and try to have fun again and trying to move on from such a unspeakable tragedy, or not even a miscarriage. That's not even right. It's a stillbirth really is what she thinks it is, which is so much worse. So yeah, I think it makes sense to me in that context that she's trying to do something different to challenge herself and try to forget and move on because she's just had this trauma. You see more of it in the JMD run at the same time. There's a couple more issues where they more explicitly kind of talk about, that they start to, paint the nursery that they had ready. They're starting to paint over it and what that was like for them. There's not a lot of discussion of the trauma of the stillbirth, obviously. We do see Alice Among Grain here and the idea that something's happening, which is never really properly followed through on unless you read Spider-Girl, because then it is. But yeah, so to me, it didn't really bother me because it made sense for me in context of what she must be going through. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense to me. It's just interesting to look at it from like a macro level. Like I can feel the rubber band, like it stretched as far as it could away from the norm, which is like them having a baby and like them, editorial, like wanting to send Peter off. And you can feel that rubber band snapping back, which is like, we've got to get these characters back to normal. Like we've got to restore what made them originally attractive, which is like youth and, whether it's in character or not, for her to like want to move past her trauma. Like you can feel in this scene, to me, it felt very like, oh, this could have been plucked out of Amazing Spider-Man from the 60s and 70s. Like it's not super reflective of like these people bought a house and were painting like the nursery, like you said, and I get where this fits in, right? Like, but like if it's a midlife crisis or whatever, but like in a vacuum, it's like, oh yeah, like this is the Archie-ification. It's like we're going back to like what these like the middle ground of this is. And yeah, I guess I wasn't expecting to read a scene like this because my memory of it is the miscarriage and the all of that heightened drama. So to see something so carefree, which is in the text, like it was, oh yeah, okay, we're watching this stuff, like, snap back until MJ gets killed in a plane crash and yada yada.
Yeah, it's interesting when you think about it in that respect. We're, I guess, 2 years away from the plane crash, but also 2 years away from finding out that he was going to be a father, or like it's 2.5 to 3 years. So it's interesting. It kind of takes place in that kind of weird interperiod, which is, again, everything about this comic is in between those two extremes, right? Like it just kind of lives in this weird, kind of vacuum on its own, where again, it is kind of forgotten for that, because it's not pushing the envelope, it's getting back to basics. But for a lot of people, that's, there's a lot of back to basic stories. So you don't necessarily need to go back and experience this. I would recommend people do it anyway, because I do think it's a fun period. And again, I love subplots. I love feeling like the world feels lived in. I do feel like Spider-Man, more than any other book, is a world I wanted to live in. I wanted to see, I feel like over time, more and more characters get symbiotes, become villains. It's less interesting to me when everyone in his life is connected to his Spider-Man life. But this is back when the period before that happened as much. So I did feel like, this was revisiting a period I enjoyed for that reason. It is weird, as you say, to kind of see Peter being a little carefree, given how close this is to all this trauma. But I guess for me, it's easier to be like, what? He's probably just, in denial himself.
I'm not knocking it. I agree with you. I just like, it reads like they're trying to figure out like what's next. Like we put them through all of this, like, what do we want to do with these characters, and the safe place to land is kind of like back where they started, and it's refreshing. Like, I'm looking at this image of Peter kissing MJ in the middle of this crowd, and it's beautiful and fun and full of energy and everything you just described. And like, sometimes the rubber band has to snap back, and like it's just like it was such a task to go from miscarriage and identity and all of that stuff back here, and I don't know if they ever landed somewhere where they felt truly comfortable, given like they would try to kill MJ off, and the gathering of the five and all that stuff, and then the Mackie stuff. It didn't really ever find its footing again as to like what the new status quo would be, and I think solidly until like JMS, which is not to say these aren't good comics, but they feel like they're in the middle of like what is the identity of this book, and like what are we focusing on, and maybe that's the strength of JMS, is that he chose to really just make it a triptych, right? It's just MJ, Aunt May, and Peter, and maybe that was the right choice, is just to go like, hey, like let's get these guys down before we really move on to something much more expansive.
Yeah, I could see that. One thing I do, like, I reject the notion that Spider-Man always has to be young. I don't think that's true. But what I do think is interesting from a narrative perspective is I do think that having him in school of some kind does give it more of his life feels like it's moving forward, even if it's like, we know it's never really going to get there, but it at least feels like it's going somewhere. Whereas when we just see him having job after job that doesn't really seem to mean anything, it feels like his arc of life isn't going anywhere. Whereas there's something about this artifice of him being in school and therefore, in theory, training for something, or to, getting prepared to move into some sort of field. I feel like the illusion of change is more realistic there for me, and I'm more okay with it. So like here, he's back at school again, so is MJ. I'm along with that. I'm like, all right, well, people go back to school. Like, and I think it just feels like it has more of a narrative propulsion, and I don't feel sorry for, like, I guess the problem is as Peter gets older, or doesn't get older, as the case might be, it just feels like he becomes more of a pitiable character to me, and not a character I want to be. I want to have my life together, and he never has his life together at all. And I'm like, that doesn't need to be Peter necessarily. He needs to be confronted with things and have to make choices, but his life doesn't have to suck. And I feel
I wrote a whole letter about that that was printed in issue 60. So I won't get into that, but I laid out my thoughts on it, and I very largely agree with you. And you're right. I think there is something about school where it's like, that there may be a diploma at some point, or he's got to keep up with his classes lest something fall out, at the bottom. And I guess a job could be the same way. I think freelance stuff doesn't feel quite as oppressive. I mean, maybe, some runs will lean into like the rent element, like I got to make rent, and they get to choose when rent is due, so that they can apply pressure in whatever script that they want. Like call me when there's a story about Peter working somewhere long enough that he's up for a promotion, and like that's not really. I mean, I guess the closest we get to that is like Dan Slott, where he gets upgraded to like Horizon Labs, and although he seems to kind of fall backwards into that, there's like, I don't know if it's nepotism in that case, but there is like, he gets elevated kind of artificially there, and then the world gets rewritten and he's, running his own company. We've not really seen a story where like there's actual room for advancement for Peter at his job. So I guess I agree with you, at least until writers decide that there's a job that's consistent enough for Peter, that we could see him advance in it in some way. I guess he sold the Webb's book, and that counts maybe as an advancement on his photography. He's a published photographer. I don't know.
It is interesting, like thinking about it. Like is he the only hero really who's have no real sense of like permanence as a job? Because everyone else kind of has something. Or is it just like the writers don't really want to? They know they have to write Peter more than they have to write like other alter egos. Like a lot of characters don't have as much of an alter ego. They don't have to worry about it as much. But with Peter, you have to deal with the alter ego because people are there for Peter too. And so you got to give them some Peter stuff. But they also don't know what to do with Peter. They don't know what jobs that to really put Peter into that are going to be interesting to write about. So they just kind of lean away from it. Whereas, again, when he was in school, it felt nebulous enough that you just needed to show him leaving class or entering class, and we kind of got it. Whereas you put him at a company, now we're like, well, how does that work? We want to know. We can't just, have a suspension of disbelief. We want to know what Peter's doing. Who else is at work? And they're like, I don't want to deal with that. Like, I don't know if it's part of that. And it's just like, that would be extra work on a writer that's really not going to lead anywhere. So they're like, let's just focus on the Spider-Man stuff. Do you think there's any credence to that, or if it's something else?
Yeah, I think there's credence to that. I think the real thing is just that like photography never really fit, like he's not a reporter, like he's a science guy, and like yet he got turned into a photographer. I think because Stan Lee was like, how do I get this guy at the center of action? And that's kind of the archetype. And so like, he's not really ever had like a definitive job that made a lot of sense for him. Like Horizon Labs, I thought like made sense, and I really liked him as a high school teacher. Although the minute you start thinking about like, maybe if he got tenure and was protected by a union, he could stay there. But like, I would imagine he would get fired straight away, given how like unreliable he is. So like. Freelance works for him because he's unreliable, and yet like doing freelance photography feels wrong. And so Horizon was like freelance science, and I guess you can't do that forever. But to me, it's like, I mean, it's been 20 years since we had Peter doing photography at the middle of the Brand New Day run, like when he gets found out for plagiarizing or like photoshopping a photograph. Like that's the last time I think he's been canonically employed as a photographer. He had a brief stint as like a science editor at the Daily Bugle at the end of the Dan Slott run. So that's kind of been excised from the character. I guess the book is doing something right now where he's like entering a photo competition. So like, to me, that's a big question mark. You're right. So I agree with everything you said. But for me, I mostly chalk it down to like, the definitive job for Peter Parker across media is that he's a photographer. And yet in the comics, it's like, we've explored that and it's really not the perfect fit for him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love the Horizon Lab stuff. I thought it made sense for the character, and it felt honestly, it just felt like that was a new avenue that we hadn't been around, really. I mean, that being said, he had worked at a think tank like that before at the beginning of the Howard Mackey run that everyone forgets about that. But this was much better, done, and it felt like Slott was much more invested in what that was going to look like and how it was going to work with his life and how he was going to be able to push Spider-Man into doing new things and actually have a supporting cast of people who came from that. Whereas I feel like Mackey didn't come into it with as fully baked in ideas. So on the face of it, they look very similar, but Horizon Labs was a much more well-developed concept. It is interesting. I hadn't realized how many years it had been since he's actually canonically been a news photographer. Yeah, and yeah, you're right. Everyone thinks of him that way, though. And would it have been easier if they just made him a reporter, like just made him like Clark Kent, and not just kind of dropped the photo aspect?
I mean, the photo thing was always fun because he was getting one over on Jonah. You know what I mean? Like in a way that like writing articles wouldn't, I think, necessarily be the same way. Like I think that's what always made it fun. And that association between Peter and Spider-Man always left open questions that people never looked at closely enough. But what have you? Yeah. I don't even know what I was saying, but he's not been a photographer for quite a while in the comics, and maybe that's coming back in some way. It feels like eventually we always get back there, but you also couldn't do Horizon forever because it's almost too much of a win for Peter. He gets to have an anonymous lab and create all new tech for Spider-Man, and that's his job. Like that feels almost. I know you want him to have some wins, but he can't have all wins. Because I think then you start losing the other aspect of the character that's relatable. So, yeah, it's a little all over the place, and whatever, change is the only constant, I guess.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I'm curious to see. Well, first of all, someday you and Mark are going to get to this era, and I'm very excited to hear what that's going to be like. It's so many years away, but I'm very excited to see what you two are going to make of this particular run because, again, I have such a vested interest in revisiting my childhood, I guess. So I'll be very, very interested to see what you guys think of this. What do you think Mark would take from this?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, Mark wrote a lot about this era on his Chasing Amazing blog, and I think he's not. I mean, I guess he wrote more about the Mackey stuff than this, and he's much more familiarized on the. Like, I've read the Mackey stuff like twice, I think, and don't really intend on revisiting it. Other than I use my show as an excuse to revisit a lot of stuff, and so I tend to hold off on reading them until I read them for the show to get like a more fresh take on it. I don't know. I mean, like this particular story, I think Mark would dig. I mean, I know that he likes, the story where a Web of Death, where Kane kills Dr. Octopus. So, like, I can't imagine he, or was it Web of Life? I can't remember, but
no, it was Web of Death.
Web of Death. Yeah. So, like, I have to think he would like the bookend of this. I've never spoken to him specifically. For all of our talking about Spider-Man, I've never spoken to him about like this era in great detail. So yeah, I'm very curious. Like, I've intentionally held off on rereading the Clone Saga in great detail just because I want to cover it on the show and cover it in a way that like where I'm kind of fresh on it. And it's not like it's also more fun to read it if you don't know it from front to back. Doing like Stan Lee and the John Romita era on the show was great fun, but I've also read those comics dozens of times, so it feels a little more like a chore getting through them, when you're not ready to be surprised by what you find on the page. And I found doing this with you very surprising how much I found to really like, and how much felt really fresh. So I don't know. I'm excited about that. It'll probably come sooner than you realize. I mean, we're covering, publicly, we're kicking off season 7 in a few weeks, and so we're getting into the Michelini stuff. And so we're entering. I mean, I guess it's what, like 120 some issues from now, but like we're entering properly into the 90s. I can't imagine we'll do like 3 seasons on the Clone Saga, although who knows. But like I think we're gonna get to this stuff sooner than you might think.
Now, tell us about the newest season. Like, what has it been like to kind of get back in touch with the Michelini run? I mean, obviously, for both of you, I mean, I guess for you, it's kind of more the later half of Michelini's run is more of a connection to your youth, whereas with Mark, it's actually right in this period. So what has that experience been like to kind of break down this season, decide how many episodes, and really start kind of mapping it out?
Well, you know, we enter into every season and we're like, let's make this a shorter season. And then it never is. They always end up being like a dozen or so episodes. You know, I think we had a season that had 8 episodes in it, and we were like, that's the sweet spot. And once you get into the 90s, there's just so much Spider-Man content, even outside of the comics, to cover that, like, I just don't know how, you know, like even breaking it down to the 12 episodes that we're doing for the first half of the Michelini run feels like it's not nearly enough. Like we're doing a whole episode on the graphic novels, and so we're covering 4 graphic novels in one episode, you know, and I'm sure we could do a lot more, you know, on that if we really wanted to. So, in the same way, it feels good to kind of like come in with an overview kind of, approach and come up with some interesting, conceits to what each episode will be and how it's formatted. We have some really unique takes on episodes coming up this season that I don't really want to spoil, but some new formats that we've never really done before on the show. I guess I'll say it here, Adam. I'll give you a little scoop. Our second episode of the season is going to be in a debate style format. You know, obviously we've had conversations where we've disagreed before, but this will be explicitly set up as a debate. And I expect things to get, I don't know if heated is the word, but we're looking to provoke conflict. And so I think that will be a lot of fun. You know, and every season we kind of, at least I like to push the boundaries a little bit of like what we can do with podcasting, and you know, whether it's do like, you know, narrative storytelling or even the stuff that I did with like Ron and Tom Brevoort when we went page by page through an issue and have them describe the process via which it was made, or as a historian. So for me, the seasons are where I get to experiment and kind of go outside of the realm of just doing single issue reviews like we do with every issue of Amazing. So that's really exciting. And Michelini's run, it felt like to us like capturing the like Image founders and their era on the book really feels like distinctly its own thing. And that like having the season end with Larson and McFarlane going off and founding Image Comics like felt like a fitting bookend to the first half of that run. And you say I feel more familiar with the second half, but really my first issue was 375, and you know, that's still very much the tail end of Michelini's involvement in the title. And over the years, in terms of me rereading Michelini stuff, I tend to reread the first half way more. It's the Venom stuff and McFarlane, and like that to me, those are the most exciting stories from the Michelini run. Like as much as I love Bagley and all the stuff he contributed, like I think there's a lot of really forgettable stories in the second half of the Michelini run. So frankly, I'm kind of curious to check them back out again, just because there's like, you know, like there's like Assassination Nation and stuff like that I just like, I know they exist, but like, you know, there's even a Sinister Six arc in there that I couldn't tell you anything about because it's just so unmemorable to me. So Yeah, I mean, like even amongst like stuff that I grew up with, like there's still a bunch of stuff that I'm like eager to go and revisit with fresh set of eyes, if that makes any sense.
It does. I'm going to be pedantic for a second, only because someone recently pointed it out to me when I said it. So you said it was a assassination nation. It's assassin nation plot. I always
there
add
you
that
go.
as well. It's an
Well,
interesting Mandela effect. I could swear it used to be different, but yeah, that catches me every time.
Oh, that's interesting. Now I'm like Googling it. I totally believe you, but there. You know what it is? Assassination Nation is the name of a movie that I saw at Sundance, directed by Sam Levinson. That like was very memorable to me, and I wonder if that's why I'm mixing it up. But you're right. Like in my brain, I see Assassination Nation on the cover. Fascinating how our brains do these things.
That's right. Well, I'm very interested to see what it's like as you guys progress through. A question I would have then, as you try to kind of figure out new ways to challenge yourself and challenge the content and the delivery system and try to do things in a different way. Are there ideas that you had from previous seasons that were end up on the cutting room floor that you really wish you could have gotten to, or things that you wish you could have done?
I mean, it's mostly interviews or like having guests, right? Like we always write up our plan for the season, say we're going to try to get X, Y, and Z because we have a really cool idea for what we want to do with them with this thing. And then for whatever reason, we're not able to get them on the show. And so we have to come up with a plan B, this season I'm working hard to get Todd McFarlane on the show, and he's been on in the past, but only like through my work with the Hollywood Reporter. He's such a big name, getting an hour of his time, probably very difficult. So then you have to think, okay, like, so if it's not Todd, like what would be the most interesting pairing, with that content to make it interesting, because Mark and I could talk about Todd for sure. But we've talked about it so much, I'd like to get a different perspective. I'm not going to say who our idea is if we don't get Todd for this season, because that also would be very exciting. And I don't want to jinx it by saying quite who we have in mind. But there's a number of things over the years where it's like it would be cool to get so and so. So for example, like doing an episode on Kraven's Last Hunt, we reached out to JMD, and he's like, honestly, I'm really done talking about Kraven's Last Hunt. I don't know what else there is to say about it. And it's like, yeah, that's right. Like we wanted to do a page by page with him, talking through like an issue of the book, and that's a format I really like, and we're not going to be able to do it. So we have another plan that I think is going to be really cool. But if you're asking me kind of generally, I'm not sure I have a ton of like things I can pull out of my mind of like, we wanted to do this, but we couldn't do it, because it's very common. Like most of the stuff we come up with, we're like, well, that would be the ideal, and let's see what we can do. Like we're not Adam Chapman, where we can just get anybody we want on the show, I mean, sometimes whatever, it's like limitation is, creates creativity, right? Like, so like if we can't get that, we still want an interesting show. And so we try to come up with a new angle on how we want to talk about something. Are there any that stand out to you? Like, oh, that was a cool like angle to take on it. I mean, like getting, and I'd like to do more of this, although it's hard to get people for this. Like we had Mark Wade on to talk about like Peter's parents, right? And we thought that would be fun because he wrote Family Business, which lightly touches on the spy element of Peter, but doesn't really touch much on his parents, other than the fact that they maybe had another child. And so like to us, that was an exciting way to get like a different viewpoint on something that wasn't Mark and me. But from someone inside the industry, and to have them on to talk about their own stuff. Yeah.
That was actually the one I was going to mention, because I like that, because it wasn't something I would have immediately thought of. But it was interesting to get someone else's point of view on it. So I mean, I like when you guys do have another voice in the room. It's interesting over the years. I feel like you and Mark it's almost like you guys have kind of come together in the middle a little bit, in terms of some of the viewpoints. And so I think it is interesting when you do have another kind of counterpoint voice that is different, and if it's someone in the industry, even better, to kind of bring a different flavor to it, or just to attack something differently, even if it is someone involved with that. Like, for example, not that I should be mentioning other podcasts right now that aren't yours, but I listened to one recently and I know one of the co-hosts, but not the other. And the other co-host had Brian Hitch that he was talking to. But it wasn't like a straightforward interview. It was more of a, like, what are the favorite things in your collection type of thing. Now, it got into some of the things that actually drove him as an artist. It was really interesting, but it wasn't your typical road into the interview. So as someone who's done a lot of interviews, I'm like, oh, that's really interesting. It's a different way to get something out of your subject. And so you ended up touching on some of those things that you would have wanted to know about anyway, but you got there in a more organic way, in a different way than you would normally. So I like that kind of stuff that plays with the form. So when you have people on like Mark Waid, and it's not a direct line, but you can make the line, I find that really interesting as someone who has interviewed a lot of people.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's absolutely right. And like, as to Mark and I like coming together, I don't know who's bending to who, because we don't like plan stuff out ahead of time. We just kind of end up having kind of similar takes on a lot of things, even though we're both very opinionated people. Like sometimes we both have the same take. That's a hard take, and it feels weird to agree on some stuff, but we do. I suspect that might be coming to an end. And I think you can kind of distinguish our characters. Like, I tend to be, I think, and I criticize myself because I think I tend to be more forgiving and favorable on stuff that Mark is just kind of like, this is crap. Why are you giving it credit, Dan? So I think I'm like often softening. Like, I feel like more often than not, Mark is like, I really didn't like this, but then I talked to you about it, Dan, and I like it a little bit more. And that might just be from the matter of talking to me. I tend to not get very like upset about comics, or like, I truly reserve my hatred for books that I find really awful. Like, I'm not handing out Fs on books often, because like I've read a lot of comics, and I tend to think most of them are like okay. There's at least something I like about it, or else I wouldn't be spending my time talking about them. I don't know what it is. Maybe I will become more hard over time, but with the Joe Kelly run coming up on the book, I know Mark is no fan of Joe Kelly and his writing style. And so like, I suspect, and I'm not a tremendous fan of Joe Kelly, but I think I suspect I will be more kind on the book than Mark. So that'll be interesting to see play out if I am ultimately correct in that.
I mean, I guess that'll be more interesting content for your listeners.
Perhaps. We'll see. I of all, I don't really. I mean, content is good. Like, that could be fun. And I know there's people that listen to us that don't read the comic and they kind of keep up with it through the show. But like, honestly, all I want is a good, Amazing Spider-Man comic. Like, if Mark and I get boring talking about Spider-Man because we just like it so much, I prefer that. Like, my main goal is I want to be reading good comics.
Question for you. So it's interesting, obviously, over the years, as you've developed your season model, and then in between seasons, you still have, ongoing reviews. Have you ever toyed with the idea of just not doing the reviews anymore? Or does that feel like such bedrock to what you do now that it would be hard to excise that, to just focus on the seasons?
it's tough because like we started doing the reviews and like I feel like they still get the most energy and character out of us. Like we just did a review of the second arc of Ultimate Spider-Man, and I had a really fun time laughing about our commentary on that issue in a way that like I don't think the seasons really bring out our personalities quite as much, just because it's like older content, right? We're not reacting to it live, or like our tempers aren't quite up if something is truly bad or like good. And so it really feels essential to me that like we keep doing the reviews. It's weird because like it definitely limits who we can get on the show. Like if I'm being totally honest with you, like some of these people won't come on just because like why would you go to the critic of your work to open up? If we were just an interview show, it'd probably be a completely different thing. And so I think it is why a lot of people come back to the show, but it also is limiting in some way. And the reality is it's easier to do the reviews than it is to like spend all of our time doing the research for the seasons. And I like to have like pretty consistent content. And so the reviews kind of are there to be the kind of bedrock of the show. But sometimes it does feel like we're talking about an issue and it's like we always have something to say. But they can be very it's a lot of like similar content. Will that get old after a while for us to talk about it? Probably. I don't know. I think Mark and I are at the very least locked into issue 1000 to say like, look, we covered this arc of Spider-Man from the beginning of Superior up through issue 1000. Like, how has the comic changed? Is it still exciting us? And I think that will be a real determining point for the future of the show. Is like, hey, like we made it through 1000. That feels like a major, line of demarcation. Like, are we still excited about covering this book in the same way? I mean, we were really not excited about the book during Volume 3, which is when we invented the seasonal stuff, because we were just like, we really weren't enjoying the book. We needed something that was going to make us excited, and so for me, like, I'm always going to be reading Spider-Man, good or bad. I consider myself a historian at this point, and so I would be more curious about it than not. Like the amount of living in my brain that $5 of spending on a comic would burn, not knowing like what's going on with the book at the time, good or bad. It is worth spending the money for me. But I guess I don't really hold the show to any particular format, but the reviews do feel essential. Do you feel like the reviews still are the backbone? Or I mean, I imagine your interest is more in the season stuff because you love history more than I think criticism.
I think more than anything, I come to listen to you guys. Like, I like the banter between you guys, and so whether it be about a new issue or an old issue, it almost doesn't make a difference. Like, I buy the issues anyway. I'm going to formulate my own opinions. But I think in general, I like you guys. Like, I think of, I listen to the Excellent Adventure podcast, which is Matt Myra, who used to be on the Nerdist back in the day, and his wife. And it started out as an infertility podcast. And so at the time when it started, my wife and I were, I think, either thinking about IVF or we were in that realm. So it was pertinent information. I already liked him as a host of podcasts. I listened to a bunch of others he did, but I'm like, all right, I'll give this a shot. Now, over the years, we ended up not doing that. We adopted a little girl, so we ended up going in a different direction. Him as a host, they ended up having a science baby, and they haven't had another science baby. But they keep the podcast going. So in every podcast, I listen to the first maybe 15, 20 minutes because I just want to hear about them. I find them interesting as a couple. I like hearing what's going on with them. And then they segue into kind of more stuff that's more about IVF that listeners are sending in questions and stuff. I'm like, you know what? That's not really for me. I'm okay. But I still download every episode because I want to hear about what's going on with them. I feel like if you guys weren't reviewing new issues of Amazing Spider-Man, I'd still want to hear what you guys are talking about, because I do find you guys interesting. It's such a weird, listening to a podcast is such a weird voyeuristic experience, because I'm not part of your friendship, but I feel like I am anyway. And we all do, to any podcast we listen to, if we're really into the hosts, is that we feel like we know them, even though we don't actually know them. They don't know us. So it's a really weird, kind of experience.
Right,
the
parasocial
even if you guys
thing,
weren't, I'm part of your relationship, even though you don't know me, like type of idea. It's really, really weird and creepy when you think about it. But you're also, it's just people find a lot of comfort in finding people that they like listening to and would like to listen to more. So you guys are always interesting to talk to, because you do have different opinions, even if sometimes, as I said, like sometimes it feels like you're more centered towards each other, but you do have very distinct ideas and voices. So it's interesting to hear you guys talk. So whether it be about a new issue or an old issue, I would listen anyway.
The reality is we do the show because we like each other, right? Like I think it would be silly after like we're entering into we are completing our 12th year of the show, like it's not really about Spider-Man. It is and it isn't. It's about like Mark and my friendship that keeps it going. Because that's the main draw. Like, so the way we started the show was me being like, I would run away from podcasting, but if running away from podcasting meant like not having Mark be a part of my life, then you're right. I would probably come back to it. Now, getting Mark to come back to it would be a whole other thing. But I feel like sometimes I have him like locked up in my basement. Like, okay, Mark, now it's the time for you to talk. He was very, like reluctant to do the podcast at first. And I feel like I pulled having him there for 12 years feels like I pulled like some kind of heist of his soul or something like that. So maybe I should be apologizing. But so this is where I'm going to tell you, we're actually going to pivot the show to just be about spiders in general. We're both going to become like major arachnid fans, so we don't have to change the name of the show. Mark and I often joke about like starting a movie podcast just because we have completely opposite opinions about movies. And it would actually cause conflict, which is something that we largely avoid talking about comics. For whatever reason, like our tastes are completely aligned there, but when it comes to movies, they're not at all. And so we're like, how would that work? Like, would it end up destroying our friendship? Like, did we just find the one subject we happen to be really copacetic on? I don't know. But at the end of the day too, like I also really like talking about new issues of Spider-Man comics. Like the podcast has filled in for like me talking to the guy at my shop who really just does not want to talk to me about Spider-Man anymore, and I think it serves that purpose for a lot of people, like they don't have someone to talk to about Spider-Man. And Mark and I are that, like you said, like that kind of parasocial friend, whether you know us or not. And you've been a guest on the show, Adam, so you do know us. In some regard, like but it does serve that purpose for people, and it serves that purpose for me, like be it selfish, like I need someone to talk to. I was like, Mark is the person I want to talk to about this, and that's why I sent him an email and said you should create a podcast with me, and he told me no. Like, I don't know who you are. I like set my sights. I said, that's the person I want to talk about Spider-Man with. And you too, Adam. You are another person I want to talk Spider-Man with. So I'm always grateful when you have me on the show to do so.
It's always a pleasure having you on. It's funny, I said before we started recording, okay, I got to be done by 9 o'clock. It's 45 minutes. We got this. It's about an hour later. I have moved while we've been talking to a different venue in my home. So this is how much I like talking about Spider-Man with you. And as I've said before, like if in any way I can be involved in your show when you get to my favorite period of Spider-Man comics, please reach out.
Adam, you don't have to beg for that. You are penciled in already. like that will be the Adam Chapman season. Like I'm expecting you as a permanent third third chair. Now the real question will be, will you pass my standards for recording and etc. I may end up buying you a whole all new gear, Adam, and I have done that.
Years to go, right?
Yeah, well, I have done that before. Like, we have Alan Scherstl on our show, which to me is a major get, and I went out and purchased him all new equipment just to get him up to speed. So Adam, if you can commit to a season of talking about this stuff, which clearly you can, maybe you'll have a little Santa Claus in your future in the form of Dapper Dan Gvozden over here.
I mean, that sounds amazing. It's interesting, as my show has evolved over the years, I realize how many of my interviews have been just dedicated to 90s comics. I just love 90s comics, specifically 95 to 99. I'm a big fan. I pick up a book from that period. Something about it just makes me feel warm inside. But the amount of interviews I've had with people in editorial at that time at Marvel, it has really become my bailiwick. And so there's it's just become this undercurrent of well, if they've worked at Marvel in that period, I'm gonna ask. So that's just become a hallmark for me. One of those things I have to ask about all the time. Is there a hallmark for you that you feel something that you really always want to kind of zero in on when it comes to Spider-Man that isn't maybe always talked about, but something you love to get into, especially if you talk to a creator who worked in a specific period?
I mean, I think most people know, whether jokingly or not, my favorite kind of fixations over the years. I mean, we did 3 episodes on the Hobgoblin, and that's not by mistake, that's one of my, and Mark too. Something we really bond over was how much we wanted to investigate all the personalities in there. I think for me, the main thing is, and again, I'll have more news on this in the coming months, but a larger project that I'm working on that I think, Adam, you know about. I'm fairly certain you do. But for me, it's the cultural reflection and how it shows up in Spider-Man, whether it's it's the everyman of Peter Parker, or the anyone can wear the mask, or the city of New York being a character. For me, every issue that I read reminds me of where I was when that came out, and my life showing up in it, or how the world around me is reflected in the pages of Spider-Man. Sort of that old Marvel, thing. But it's neat to go through my issues and be oh, there's the black one, and that's the 9/11 issue, right? That carries a sort of meaning to it. And so I like to find out where the writers and artists are kind of coming from, and how their worldview or what's going on with them injects itself into the work. I love everything about Jerry Conway being 19, coming on the book and bringing that sort of post-Vietnam anger to the book, but also the silliness of what a 19-year-old would come up with. And I feel you see that in his run. It oscillates between deeply silly stories or darker, genre pushing stories like Death of Gwen, or the Clone Saga, these kind of more tortured elements. And I find that really interesting. Well, especially with him. We've had him on the show 9 times, and his career being as long as it is, you get to see a guy really evolve and mature as a person throughout a title. That's what is curious to me, is even someone like Tom DeFalco. I don't know if he gets terribly personal with his stories. They're not really about him, which is also interesting. And why I like Ron and Tom so much is they are about upholding a legacy, and they feel like Pete is a real guy. It's not a reflection of Ron and Tom. More than it's a reflection of what would Pete's life be like. And that's interesting too. Like, not only their interpretation of the character, but like, what does it mean to divorce yourself from this? And how does that style of writing differ from other people? Like Michelini's stories in like the later half become really political and interested in stuff like that. And so like it's like, okay, well, what was going on at the time that he felt, like injecting that into the story? Maybe it was the Clintons, scandals, or and so that's the stuff that really interests me. Seeing it like on the page, because these books don't. I don't know. There's that whole Comic Gate thing of like get your politics out of my comics, and it's like things have been political from the very beginning. In the second issue of Amazing Spider-Man, you have like a young kid fighting like an octogenarian, like who felt like the world was stolen from him, and it's like there's a real like class and age struggle there, and like this whole pushback against like the elites and elders, of society and their way of thinking. Like that's been a part of the character from the very beginning. It's political, and that stuff interests me the most. So anytime I get to like comment on that, feels valuable to me. It's not often, because in the moment you might not be able to pick up on the themes that are, coming through that seem very clear later on. But if I can tap into that, that's the stuff that excites me.
That makes sense. One, I guess, parting word I will say is that I feel like you could have had more episodes in the Hobgoblin, but I feel like you restrained yourselves.
Yeah, no, trust me, 3 episodes was a restraint, and I get the emails from Glenn Greenberg as well. Like he wants to come on and correct some of the record, and I'm sure we'll get to that at some point. But we're in the 90s, so Hobgoblin lives. Like I guess we covered that back in that season, but to me, it was very clear, like the way to divide it up into 3 episodes. But there's so much more we could have done. And part of me, like, maybe wants to do a whole season just on the Hobgoblin, but I relent. Like time has to march forward, and so instead we'll do 5 episodes on Facade, and and that'll be where our energy goes. So, yeah.
Oh, Facade. It's funny. You wouldn't have seen it because you read it digitally, but Amazing Spider-Man 426 does, on the Bullpen Bulletins board, does have an editorial profile in Glenn Greenberg himself.
Well, there you go. It all comes back around. And Facade is a fun one for me, if only because I was buying issues out of order at the time. And so I had all of the Facade issues. But I didn't know that I had all of them. And so for years, I thought I had just been missing an issue where it was revealed who Facade was. And it felt like this burning hole in my collection, for years. Like, what is the issue? What one did I miss? Only to find out that I actually hadn't, because they never revealed who it was. But I think for like 20 years, before, like pre-internet, I thought like, God, there must be something that I'm missing here, because like I need to know who this guy is.
I will say, I think we all have a character like that we accidentally become the biggest fan of that character, or we become more invested than we should be because we don't realize that that's all they're ever going to be in. Like, I've already talked about Delilah and Stunner. I knew everything about these characters, didn't realize I had most of their appearances already. Like, it's very funny how that happens.
Oh yeah, totally. And like Razorback has been a long favorite of mine, who, I don't know, maybe a dozen appearances over the years, but it's like I've got an action figure of him on my computer, like sitting on top of my computer right now. Like, you can't convince me he's not the best Marvel character ever invented.
Outstanding. Well, I think that's probably the best way to end off this discussion, which has gone in so many different. I think so. Which has gone in so many wonderful tangents. So, Dan, thank you so much for taking so much of your time. I know you're a very busy man, but thank you for taking so much time and reading these 3 Spider-Man comics and going back to, I guess, to my childhood to experience these. So, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Of course. Is that what we were talking about? Yeah, it's always.
About an hour ago, yeah.
Yeah. It's always a pleasure, Adam. Even if we always go way too long. If you're listening to this by now, like, I guess I'll see you in 20 or so episodes when I make my inevitable appearance on the next Centennial.
That's right. You better believe it. I will not let that go by without you showing up.
I'm putting it on my calendar now, sometime in July.
That's right. Actually, I might postpone it to August 12th because there's something about having the Centennials on my anniversaries for the show. So it'll be coming out August 12th. So we'll record it sometime leading up to that.
All right. Well, I look forward to it, Adam.
All right. Thanks so much, Dan.